Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the participants from across the globe, wherever you are. My name is Raj Bojunat, and I'm the chair of the ISSUP UK chapter. And welcome, everybody, to this webinar, which is on workforce wellbeing in crisis response. I am informed that we have about 679 registered participants and from 89 countries. Wow, that's great. That's fantastic. And thank you all for registering. UK ISSUP chapter was launched last year, and today's presentation is a continuation of our year-long webinar plan on young people, substance misuse, and families. The UK ISSUP chapter is hosted by Middlesex University and is managed by the Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, known as DARC for short. Details of both the global ISSUP and the UK chapter, as well as other countries' chapters, can be found on the ISSUP website. The ISSUP global membership is free, as are all the other chapters, including the UK. Our mission, vision, and key objectives are aligned to the global ISSUP. And again, these can be found on our website, which I would encourage those not familiar to go on the ISSUP website and to look for all these details. Key objectives to promote, our key objectives is to promote knowledge, research, advice, participations on national and international policy issues, sharing good practice, organized training, and sharing and exchange of information, but very much around developing and professionalizing services across drug and alcohol services. Before we start with the program, I just want to go over a few housekeeping issues in relation to the use of the platform. As you will see, we have muted all your microphones. Please make use of the icons to write your questions, comments, and suggestions. We will have question and answer sessions at the end of this webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view later on from the ISSUP Global website, and there will be a certificate that will be also issued for participants who fully attend this webinar. Because of time constraint, which we have to manage tightly, I am going to go straight to the webinar and introduce our speaker. Our speaker for today is Dr. Jai Sri Adiharu, who is a chartered psychologist with around 20 years of experience in service development and direct work, obviously, with children, young people, and their families. I first met Jai Sri when I was Deputy Director for Children, Adult and Family Mental Health Services in West London, where Jai was the clinical lead and manager of our multi-systemic therapy service, MST for short, which was funded by the Department of Health as a national project, and the franchise was bought from the US, and where most of our clients were involved in drug use. Today's talk is related to the Grenfell fire, the Grenfell Tower Fire, which people in this country will be very familiar with, but people from around the world may not. On June 2017, a high-rise fire broke out in the 24-story Grenfell Tower block of flats in North Kensington, which is in West London. That fire started by the malfunctioning of a fridge freezer on the 4th floor. It spread rapidly up the building's exterior, bringing the fire and smoke to all the residential floors. This was due to the building's cladding and the external insulation, which, since the air gap between them, enabled the stacked effect. 72 people, so far that we know, were burnt, were suffocated or burnt alive. Scores were injured. Hundreds were left homeless in what was known as Britain's deadliest fire in more than a century. You can imagine the trauma that those who were left behind, families, loved ones, etc., and others, what they went through, and the neighboring community who witnessed that fire from their block of flats from very short distance, but could not do anything, and saw people jumping out from the tower, falling down, and the trauma they themselves experienced afterward. So it was from this Grenfell Tower that the crisis service was set up. And since 2017, Jai has been centrally involved in the development of our local NHS Grenfell and Health and Wellbeing Service for children and young people. In addition to her NHS role, Jai offers consultancy to professionals on a range of topics and specialist supervision to support helping professionals in managing the emotional impact of working with people in distress. She has a strong research interest in well-being, staff support, and burnout. And I don't need to tell you the rate of burnt out in the field of substance misuse. The high rate of turnover itself tells you a lot about it, and the high rate of sickness and working with very difficult client group. These are all combinations and services which are Cinderella of other services and poorly funded. These are all combinations where you have high rate of burnt out in this field. But she also holds a number of roles with professional regulatory bodies, including health and care professional councils and the British Psychological Society. Jai also gives lectures at the University of East London. She's a member of the Youth Justice Board Parenting Forum. She's an ambassador to the Brandon Centre, and she is on the advisory board of Hidden Strengths, which is an app-based therapy platform for children and young people. She'll probably tell you a little more about it than I do. This is quite innovative and very exciting. Jai uses a biopsychosocial evidence-based practice to develop service that offer systemic support to children, young people, and their families. And I don't need to tell you that families are becoming very, very important players in the recovery of people who use drugs and misuse drugs. Okay. So, so without kind of any further ado, I don't want to, Jai will tell you a bit more about herself. So I'm just going to go direct to the presentation and pass on the presentation to Jai. Over to you, Jai.
Thank you for that really extensive introduction, Raj, and great to meet all of you virtually today. As Raj explained, I'm focusing on workforce well-being, but I hope to have a conversational stance through this presentation, which I guess tells the story of my experiences in working in crisis response and some of the learnings that I draw from being both a psychologist, but also a service implementation specialist. It's quite an unusual combination, and as Raj alluded to, I think my experience with multi-systemic therapy for over 10 years really helped me to understand the connectedness between an individual's presenting problems and all of the many, many systems in which they have connection and interactions, whether that's the family system, their employer, their community, and so on. So this presentation sits within a systemic framework, drawing on both evidence-based research with regards to crisis response and service implementation, but also my own anecdotal experiences, which I hope you find helpful. So the aims are to provide you with an overview of the Grenfell Tower Fire. And Raj, as someone that has also lived through this experience, please feel free to interject at any time. I'm going to be talking about the service that was set up in response to the tragedy by the NHS. And I'd also like to think about the potential in this kind of work for substance use and the link to crises and disasters. I'm thinking here today about the link between crisis response support, trauma and substance use, and also almost drawing a virtual triangle between those three concepts. Because what I want to do is provide examples of service level interventions that may address factors that could lead to unhelpful coping strategies within our workforce. I acknowledge this might be a bit of an unusual angle to take, and I think much of what I say applies equally to those directly impacted and affected by any kind of trauma, crisis or disaster, as well as those working to support them. And I think the latter is perhaps not talked about, in my opinion, as much as it could be or should be within our respective areas of work. So Raj has given quite an extensive introduction to me. As I said, I work as a service manager within the NHS. I'll come on to talk a little bit more about the service that was set up in response to the Grenfell Tower Fire. But prior to the fire, a significant number of colleagues had been involved in trauma support and in offering advice and guidance at a national level in response to crises and disasters. I remember in the year and preceding years before the Grenfell Tower Fire, there had been a number of incidents, the London terror attacks that occurred in the same year in 2017. We had a terrorist vehicle ramming and stabbing incident that took place in London Bridge. There was an awful bombing at the attack at a concert in the north of England. And I'm sure across contexts, we are finding ourselves experiencing unforeseen crises, disasters and traumatic events across the globe at the moment. And the NHS has quite a central role in thinking about how we support people affected by such disasters. Since the Grenfell Tower Fire, I've also been redeployed to work on a number of other, crisis response services. COVID-19, I think, is a global crisis in that the pandemic has affected all of us around the planet in different ways. I was involved in setting up the staff vaccination hub, and more recently last year, involved in setting up and leading the response for evacuees leaving Afghanistan following the Taliban takeover. So whilst this might sound like an eclectic collection of different job roles, I hope through this presentation you'll see the common threads that I've been able to identify, and underlying that key message that regardless of our context, traumatic events can impact both people who are directly impacted, but also those who are offering support. And that's a really key message, because as Raj alluded to, when we're working with complex presentations and distressing human conditions, burnout, vicarious trauma, and a neglecting self-care can be almost an occupational hazard. So it's something that we have to focus on quite proactively, I think, to acknowledge that as if we were working on a building site, we'd have hard boots to protect us. We also need to think about, when we're working with very complex human distress and emotions, we're also affected, and we need to think about how we can take care of ourselves as professionals to provide the best service to those that we are trying to support.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, if you want to put your presentation on full screen slideshow mode, a little bit along to the left, yeah, that one. You should be able to see it full screen.
There we go. Yes.
And then if you want to change the display settings, apologies, at the top. At the top,
there we go.
Yeah. Swap presenter view, that should hopefully.
There we go. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Good stuff. Okay, well, this is the main slide, so good time to interject. The context of the talk is a local tragedy that occurred in London in 2017. A fire broke out in the tower block, which was a residential tower block in a very densely populated part of London. My condolences are always with the families who have suffered losses, as well as those people who witnessed this tragedy. because I think it really affected more people than we will ever truly know. As Raj described, the fire started and was contained quite quickly. And I'm always very cautious to discuss the details of the fire, because there is an ongoing public inquiry around what happened and who's ultimately responsible. But I think there are some key features of this tragedy that are really pertinent. As Raj said, it rapidly spread across all 24 floors. It was long in duration. So whilst the original fire was reported just before 1 a.m., the fire took over a day to contain. Firefighters arrived at around 1 a.m. and put the initial fire out within minutes. And it was only as they were leaving that they spotted the flames rapidly rising up the outside of the building. Just half an hour later, the flames had reached the roof and the fire was completely out of control. And resident reports and observer reports indicate that there were frequent explosions, which we suspect might have been from gas lines within the building. The fire was still burning in the early hours of the morning, and because it was Ramadan, the Muslim festival of fasting, many Muslim residents were awake. And in the early hours of the morning, they were quite pivotal in helping people escape. The stay put advice has been a controversial feature of this tragedy. What I mean by that is when people were calling 999, which is our emergency services here in the UK, they were instructed to stay put. The reason for this is because fires are meant to stay contained within particular compartments, and the advice from the fire service was to stay put until it was contained. I think what adds to this tragedy is that those who perhaps didn't listen to that advice and didn't stay put were able to escape. And those that did stay put, many of those that did stay put, unfortunately did not manage to escape the building. Like a lot of tragedies and trauma, there's a significant piece around trust in authorities. And this was relevant in Grenfell and still is relevant because there was a lot of blame towards the fire service. There was a lot of blame towards the local authority or the council that's responsible for maintaining the building. And as I mentioned earlier, there's still a public inquiry about how a small kitchen fire managed to result in mass fatalities. The picture that I've included here is aimed at showing the proximity in terms of witnesses. How many other buildings were in very, very close proximity to the tower, and how prominent the tower was on the skyline of London, which meant that it was witnessed by many, many people within a very close community. As I said, I don't think we'll ever know the true extent. Even now, almost 5 years later, when I mention to people my involvement in this work, everybody has a story about where they were in London when they heard about the fire or when they saw the fire. It's hard to imagine just the reach. The fire, like many other crises, resulted in a total loss. We can see some parallels to the situations of war for those of you that are working with displaced populations, forced migrants or refugees. There is a similar feeling of total loss, i.e. there is not much to take with you. In this case, most people left with literally what they had on their person. There's also population displacement. You can see by the extent of damage caused to the building that there was absolutely no possibility of people returning to reside in their homes. So this resulted in the population being displaced, and all that goes with that, the uncertainty, the lack of sense of belonging, frustration, and so many emotions that go with losing your home and losing all of your belongings. The number of fatalities was recorded at 72, but I think there's a point here to make about inner city living more generally, that we never really know who's in a building at any particular time. And there are also practices within cities such as subletting, i.e. having a named person on a contract, and perhaps there's somebody else living there. So 72 was the official count, which included a stillborn baby and a resident that escaped but died soon after. I think what makes me really sad is that we will just never know how many people were actually in that building and how many people perished in the fire. What we do know is that when a crisis occurs, there's a human response that's activated, perhaps in all of us, and how we respond may vary from person to person, but I've observed some common features in our human response to a crisis or disaster. Often we're compelled to do something. We want to offer some assistance and help, and that might look different. I think some of the pictures here illustrate the many different ways in which the Grenfell Tower crisis compelled people to do something. I was at the site the very next morning, and the picture of the shoes in the top left-hand corner is taken from the BBC News website, but I also have a number of photographs of the sheer number of donations that arrived within the first few hours of the very next morning. People donate what they have, people donate money, people donate their time, people volunteer to help manage the donations. Food is a very central part of wanting to help and support people. There was so much food that arrived, again, the very next morning. We're also compelled to follow media reports, perhaps initially, and perhaps for some of us this turns into something else over time. But initially, when a crisis occurs, we do follow media reports. We take in information from a variety of different sources, but most often we're relying on our news channels, including social media, to tell us what's going on. For some of us, we might be triggered into thinking about events that have occurred in our own lives. This is something that I think we don't speak about too much. And whenever I'm setting up a crisis response service, I always start my conversation with teams to get people to think about where they were when they first heard the news and what compelled them to help. I think it's really important to have that degree of self-awareness about what compels us to help. There's no right or wrong answer here, but I'm often anecdotally struck by how this story links to our own stories. And perhaps events that have occurred either in our lives or in our family histories. We might be impacted directly or indirectly. And what I mean by that is when I think about the Grenfell Tower Fire, for example, many of the professionals that were supporting the residents were also residents themselves. This creates a dilemma. Are you a resident in the locality first? Are you a professional first? Can you be both? Can you be a professional and be impacted? This resonated for me personally during the COVID-19 response, where I, like many of you, was faced with the same uncertainty, a degree of panic and fear around COVID and what it meant, but also being asked to set up and lead a staff vaccination service. And if I'm perfectly honest, I wasn't sure that I wanted to be vaccinated in the very first round of vaccinations. And that was a crisis that I was both personally affected, but also professionally had to take a stance of the greater good. And I think some of these dilemmas, whether we call them moral dilemmas or ethical dilemmas, are really important to acknowledge when we're working in crisis. Over time, we might experience compassion fatigue. We might experience secondary or vicarious trauma and burnout. We might choose to manage how we stay focused on a particular crisis or disaster, but we might also find opportunities for personal and professional growth. And I think the key point for me here is that the personal and professional do overlap. Perhaps that's my training as a counselling psychologist, which merges all of the spheres of ourselves. But as you can see in the bottom picture that was taken after the London Fire Brigade had managed to put out the fire after almost a day, 24 hours, more than 24 hours. I think that picture really captures the fatigue, the exhaustion. There's a whole range of emotions I might attribute to that picture, but I thought it was really interesting that the media portrayed this group of people as heroes. And when I later went on to work with some members of the London Fire Brigade that had attended the response, they didn't feel like heroes. So there's something about the narrative that we experience and the narrative that other people give to a particular event, and how that impacts us personally and professionally. So who is impacted during a crisis? I've created this little visual just to illustrate that there's a whole range of people affected by any crisis or disaster or traumatic event, whether that's a local incident, whether that's a national incident. There are people that we might think of quite obviously, such as first responders, those directly impacted, but there are also people that we might not pay that much attention to at the outset. Journalists, for example, you know, the people that are there on site covering these events are also witnessing these events. I'm curious about how they manage to process the trauma and the human distress that they encounter. The wider public, I think with the reach of our media and social media and the internet, it's almost impossible to know how far lifetime incidents reach other people. One of my specialism is in working with children, young people and their families. And I was really struck by a call that I received from a parent in the north of England. So to give some context, it's around 200 miles away from where this fire occurred. Sorry, I can't convert that into kilometers. And a parent who said that her child was really struggling because they also lived in a flat and he'd seen this tower blaze on the news over and over again and was petrified that he would be burnt alive in his flat. So when we think about how people are impacted, the reach, as I said, is huge. And I use this kind of eco-mapping tool with teams at the outset to think about who are we going to support and who are we going to come into contact with on any given project, on any given crisis response, and how can we check that these people are being supported in their roles. In asking that question, who needs support and how will we support them, the Grenfell Health and Wellbeing Service was developed. You can check out the website to see the many different things that the Grenfell Health and Wellbeing Service now does. But it emerged through need, and it emerged initially through that human desire to offer support and help to the local community. On the day of the fire, a number of our NHS colleagues were on site to offer assistance. And when we think about what kind of assistance we offer during that time, my anecdotal experience was to listen, to try and help people understand why they were feeling what they were feeling. Of course, you're in shock. Of course, it's a horrific thing to witness. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen next. And I think immediately in that day, the next day that followed, we, the staff, were feeling a little helpless. You know, what can we do here? One of the best lessons that I learned was to think about the practical support. What do people need right now? And it could be as something as a phone, simple as a phone charger. the local community really stepped in to offer that support first and foremost, and there has been a lot written and a lot captured about the strengths and the cohesion in the community, in how churches and mosques and community centres opened their doors to set up unofficial rest centres. You know, these were places where people could stay, they could sleep, they could access mobile phones. And the NHS followed that community lead to be present where we were needed. The kinds of things that people needed at the outset were prescriptions, access to their medication, lots of practical support. What happens now? Does my child go to school? There were a number of schools in close proximity to the tower that were closed for a period of time. Where will we live? Who will organise that? What about my documents? Not all of these questions could be answered by NHS staff. However, the health service was there to provide a supportive and containing response. And all of our guidance around trauma intervention states that, you know, people will have a focus on their practical needs being met in a disaster or crisis, and we need to be flexible and adaptive in our responses. So we'd really developed a service that was based on need, a service that had a strong focus on outreach, which is what you see in the top of that diagram. Assertive outreach, being visible, being credible, being identifiable. What I mean by that is being very explicit about who we are and what we can do and also what we can't do. There's a compulsion to help, as I described earlier. But I think boundaries and not promising something that we can't deliver is equally important. Over time, we developed green lanyards to show solidarity to the Grenfell community, green for Grenfell. And our lanyards and our green hoodies became a visible symbol of our presence within the local community. There's a number of interventions that took place over time, and I'll come back to those in due course. But in a similar way, our staff also needed to know what they should and shouldn't be doing at this time. So having a visible presence, having a clear direction about the purpose of any outreach work, I think is really important. One of the key messages that I was communicating was that we are not to offer trauma intervention, almost in big capital letters. This is a tragedy. What we're seeing is a normal reaction to a completely abnormal event. We don't want to pathologize people. We don't want to enter a diagnostic framework. This is an awful, awful situation. And of course, people are going to experience a range of human responses to this. And let's be human, let's be visible, present, contain, and see if we can offer assistance in the areas that people require it. And it's through this outreach model that over time we developed a service that was based on need, a service that didn't separate adults and children, but integrated the support we provided to these families. These families had a shared experience. They'd gone through this shared trauma together. They may have been impacted differently, but we felt it didn't make sense to take the usual clinical approach of individualized treatment. In line with clinical guidelines and best practice, we did offer evidence-based treatments such as CBT, EMDR, NET. I can talk about these later in our Q&A section if you have any questions. But we also were creative in thinking about what other interventions we could offer to families. And before intervention, we undertook a screening approach. And a screening is a way of having a conversation about what is most important to those residents that are directly impacted, and also to any other community members that feel they've been impacted. The screening uses a range of clinical measures, but is employed through a conversation to ask, how are people doing? What's most important to them? What do they need help with? And I think we undertook the first school-based screening in this country, at least, that information is correct at the time of developing the screening tool, i.e. approaching school by school in the local area to ensure that we offered a wellbeing check around wellbeing and mental health to every child in the schools that were closest to the tower. I've put helpers in the top left-hand corner because we also offered a lot of support to helpers. Now, this isn't a linear timescale. Again, I'm happy to answer any questions about this because the service developed very organically over time. And that does parallel my experience of service implementation. It looks like a straight line of one thing happening after another, but often a good service implementation is going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. We recognized very early on that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the helpers were also impacted. A lot of the helpers were also resident in the local area, and a lot of the helpers didn't necessarily have training or expertise in supporting people that had witnessed a traumatic event and or who had suffered bereavement. So we offered a lot of training and support workshops around subjects like trauma awareness. For example, if somebody's trying to get their housing needs met, some of the presentation you might encounter is as a result of their experience. So I think having some context and background to understand why people might be presenting in a particular way to particular services, I hope makes us all empathic to their situation. We also held workshops on managing difficult conversations. There were many occasions when services couldn't meet a particular need, not for want of trying, but due to a lack of resource or a lack of remit. And I think having these difficult conversations when people are distressed and impacted and emotionally vulnerable is really important. For helpers, we also offered a lot of clinical and reflective space, which included supervision but wasn't restricted to supervision. And we also offered screening in the same way that we did for the residents in the community to colleagues and professionals through outreach to identify what their needs were. And these different strands came together in the first year following the fire to create the Grenfell Health and Wellbeing Service. Since that time, we've really listened to what the community wants, but also formed greater collaborations and more co-production over time to share the learning and expertise in terms of what we have learned, but also in terms of what the community can teach us about their ongoing needs. So, why is all of this relevant to this topic? Because I think there exists a link between substance use and trauma that is perhaps sometimes neglected in the clinical field. Earlier in my career, I worked in the forensic setting. Before undertaking a placement in a prison, I'd wanted to specialize in forensic psychology. And it was perhaps there that I heard many, many stories from young women. That was the group that I was working with about their early experiences. And I just remember feeling so sad and so frustrated that a 14-year-old child should end up in an institution like a prison when it felt to me that they had experienced significant trauma. I guess this model is now referred to as the ACEs and the adverse childhood experiences. So I guess it wasn't unsurprising that by 14 or 15, many of these young women had turned to unhelpful coping strategies, which included alcohol or drug use. Zooming out, we know that many people who have experienced these kind of adverse events, as well as disasters, war, and a whole range of other traumatic experiences, do turn to alcohol or drugs to help them deal with the emotional pain, with the bad memories, and some of the symptoms of PTSD. So just as traumatic events and substance use occur together, so do trauma-related disorders like PTSD and substance use disorders. These can create difficulties for the individual, not just in terms of their interpersonal functioning, but with family and friends, but crucially in terms of how they access services, with some services saying you must deal with one issue before we can help you with the other. What we've tried to do within the Grenfell Health and Wellbeing Service is really think about how we can treat people holistically. And I've shared there just some stats around alcohol abuse in particular, mainly because in Western countries, I think it can be difficult to spot. And I say that because, again, when I think about workforce and I think about some of the unhealthy coping strategies that can develop when we're working long hours, when we're working in crisis response, it can be all too easy to turn to alcohol and not notice that this is becoming an unhelpful coping strategy, either before or after a diagnosis of PTSD. So I've talked a little bit about why the link occurs, and I won't labour this point too much, but I'm sure you all are aware already that substance use can increase the emotional numbing, but it can also increase social isolation, anger, irritability, depression, and this prevents the person's ability to cope with the traumatic memories and any external stresses. So whilst it might provide temporary relief, it's actually blocking what is often natural recovery. And what I mean by that is not everybody who experiences a traumatic event will develop PTSD, but their ability to cope with that traumatic event is a key indicator on the likelihood of recovery. I'm aware of the time, and I'm going to just introduce this meta-analysis by Hopful and colleagues, which I think is a really helpful framework to think about the 5 essential elements of how we can help. What can we do in any mass trauma to help those directly affected? Hopful and colleagues point to a 5-part model, which outlines our function as helping professionals. And in this presentation, I'm going to give you just a few examples of how I've used these principles to apply the same support response to people working with those affected. So what do I mean by that? We want to offer a calm response to the community. I talked earlier about listening, understanding, not jumping in with 500 interventions when somebody just needs to know where they're going to sleep that evening. And I think it's the same response that we need to extend to staff. We need to listen and understand their compulsion to help. And we also need to be clear and calm about what we can and cannot do. It can also be calming to have a visible leadership presence, a hands-on approach, guiding from the front. It can also be calming to provide information, whether that's through psychoeducational training, such as the trauma awareness workshops that I talked about earlier. It can also be calming to normalize some of the unhealthy responses that we will observe. For example, I would ask staff to check in with me when they left a rest centre. And I'd often be calling staff who were compelled to stay there till 9 in the evening, 10 in the evening, telling them to go home. And all of this is decided to provide a calm, not a frenzied response. I've included a couple of pictures there of VR headsets. I mean, that's a conversation for another time. But we used virtual reality and calming nature environments as a way of talking to people in some of our outreach work. I can tell you more about that at another time. We also want to create safety. What I mean by that is emotional and psychological safety. When people are displaced and dispersed, they don't have a secure base. And that's why community spaces such as faith organisations or community centres become a secure base and a space to come together. In a similar way, our staff also need space to come together to avoid unhelpful coping strategies. Creating that safety is really important. And I think normalising some of the occupational hazards is also a way of creating safety to say, hey, look, you know, if you find yourself having a few sleepless nights or having an extra bottle of wine, just let's have a chat about this. You know, we can set boundaries to create safety. We can monitor sickness and absence and make sure people are taking breaks to create safety. But I think permission giving is really important. It needs to be a safe team space to say, hey, I'm not doing very well. Community. I think I've talked a lot about community through this response because the Grenfell response was really driven and shaped by the local community. And I think often when I think of various crises, there is a community that is driving a particular response. And our job as helping professionals is to understand that community, understand what they need, and understand how we can work alongside those communities. And also think about what our community is, whether we work for an organisation like the NHS, like the British Red Cross. Some organisations have a very clear identity that helps create a team community and shared values, but we can't assume that that always occurs. I've included here an excerpt from a newspaper article which highlights the centrality of faith communities in the response to the Grenfell Tower fire. And I think it reminds me to think about dimensions of faith and spirituality as a potential protective factor, buffering us against the occupational hazards of our work. I've also included there a link to an article which shows how a community created within my service, the digital sub-team, came together to support colleagues to move our work online during COVID-19. So communities can look very different within our services, within our teams, and they can extend to helping other parts of our teams and services to manage some of the hazards of the work. A lot of these factors overlap. Hopful talked about connectedness, and connection, I think, is connection to the values that drive us to do anything, but also connection to others. So for fear of repeating myself, this includes opportunities for collaboration. I've included a link here to some trauma animations on trauma that are freely available and were created in collaboration with children and young people from the local community. This helps them connect to other children and young people that have experienced something similar but also something different. And in turn, that helps to create a community of children who can utilize these resources and know that they're not alone in their experience. And likewise, for us, it's important to find our communities and connect to them, whether that's in person, through meetings, or using technology and digital tools. And lastly, to stay healthy in our work, I think we need to keep hold of hope. One of the occupational hazards that occurs and is found in concepts like vicarious traumatization is that our sense of safety and our ideas about safety and control are negatively impacted by working with trauma. And to counter that, I think hope, sharing good news stories, sharing simple messages, utilizing all sorts of support, whether that's personal therapy, coaching, or employee assistance programs, can keep us hopeful that what we're doing is making a difference. And when we're doing that well and protecting ourselves, we really reduce the likelihood of developing unhelpful coping strategies. I leave you with a quote from a young person that I interviewed, and I'd love to see a quote like that from our staff group at some point in time. We're reaching out for help and support, whatever shape or form that is in, becomes a very normal thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jayatri. This is a fantastic presentation covering a whole range of issues which the Grenfell fire brought to us. I'm just looking at questions. I can't see any except one. How have the survivors been coping, and what measures have you put in place to assist them together?
That's a really good question. I think it's variable on a case-by-case basis. People's primary need was housing. And as a health service, we struggle to think about, well, you know, what can we do here in a country, in a city in particular, where there is a housing crisis, there's a housing shortage, but yet we know from Maslow's hierarchy of needs that if your basic needs are not met, it's very, very hard to think about something else. So as we're seeing people and talking to people and trying to engage people in their recovery of trauma symptoms, we've tried to support people by supporting their applications for housing where we can, to educate others and highlight the link between trauma and a sense of safety and a sense of belonging and having somewhere safe to live. So that's one of the ways that we've supported people. We've supported people by being there through key events. I mean, one of the early events was the visit to the tower. Lots of people wanted to visit the empty shell of the tower. Even though the shell was predominantly burnt out, some people wanted to go and pay respects. Some people wanted to visit their former homes. And whilst not wanting to get the NHS Trust into trouble, I'm not sure that we were authorised to do that on the first ask, but it felt very, very important to be alongside people. If this is what they wanted, we were there to provide psychological support, emotional support, and colleagues of mine actually went into the tower so that people could pay their respects and have some kind of grief ritual. We've engaged people in trauma therapy. We've engaged people in activities to help them connect, such as gardening groups. So the response has been very varied. It's been driven, as I've said, by what people need, focused on trauma and recovery from trauma, but recognizing that sitting in the clinic and having therapy may not be the best option for everybody. I hope that answers the question.
I hope so. The next question we have, on reflection, is there anything you think you would have done differently? Because with hindsight, sometimes we all kind of think, you know, clever, better.
Oh gosh, yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts there, Raj. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. Could we have done anything differently? I mean, it's a tragedy that really sits with me and think, we can't bring people back.
No.
And if I asked the residents what they would want, I'm pretty sure they would say we would want for that fire not to have happened. In terms of our response, what could we have done differently? We are always seeking feedback from the community around that. I think we could have done more community-based work. You know, we partnered with a lot of community organisations. We offered our services in existing locations where people already attended. So we gave choice, but I think you can always have more choice. And you can always have more choice of what works. This is a tricky balance because we are a national health service. But I know in the early days for some people, they didn't want therapy. They were telling us that, you know, a head massage might work just as well. And outside my professional role, I'm quite into alternative practices. So there are lots of things that if I had freedom and scope, I think more holistic approaches might have helped. But as I said, we're always constricted by our roles and our remit in terms of what we can do.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Jess. I've got another question here. I'm going to try and I'll read it as it is. It says, did apparently dissociative identity behind the reason, poor socioeconomic status, domestic violence, subsequently lead addiction to alcoholic drinks? What's your opinion?
My opinion is.
I'm looking at. Did you find many of the residents and staff as well? You know, did you find anything related to addictions, more use of substances, because this is one of our easiest maladaptive way of coping, isn't it, when we're faced with
Absolutely.
trauma?
I think it is, and I think it is that it's an easy reach. Particularly alcohol is an easy reach because for me, in substance use, access is key. You know, if something's easy to access, we're more likely to use it. And that's why my counter argument is we need to make helpful coping strategies more easy to access so that you have a choice between the two.
Yes.
And there is a cluster effect, isn't there, that when we're not coping and we are more irritable and angry and in distress, we are more likely to be violent, to be angry, to respond in a way that isn't typical. And that does become categorized as domestic violence. But what we saw, and in later years, we did offer couple therapy to a lot of the residents and the community members, because my, again, non-stigmatizing stance on this is that unhelpful ways of communicating develop as a result of trauma. And when you put trauma and substance use together, you suddenly find that all of your relationships are strained and impacted, including the couple. And when you've got a couple that has been through the same trauma and the same distress and witnessed these horrific events, this applies equally to war and migration, and as well as the Grenfell Tower tragedy, you are going to see that impact manifest in the couple relationship, whether that's violence, aggression, or some other unhelpful coping. So absolutely, I think individual work has major limitations for that reason.
Yes. Okay, see the other questions last, which I got here, which I tried to read this and to interpret what's being said here. Did you find any differences in help-seeking behavior between men and women and those hard to reach? Because sometimes men, they say, are hard to reach, you know, when it comes to seeking help in situations like trauma, and this is where the drugs and alcohol come in, because it's the easiest way coping out. I'm just making a sweeping statement. Obviously, it is not.
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we the management team, started from a position that people are not hard to reach. We just don't know how to reach them.
Yes.
And I think that ethos was so key that taking the VR headsets out, for example, we managed to engage a lot of men because it's a gadget. Now, again, that's very stereotypical. But in the picture, you see a little boy. The little boy was actually with his father, and his father said, "Can I have a go?" And so we found ways to have conversations. This was not a conversation about trauma. This was, "Hey, we're from the NHS. We've got a VR headset here. Would you like to try a relaxing nature experience?" And once you break the ice and you have a conversation, people are going to ask, "What's the NHS doing here with a VR headset?" And we say, "Hey, we're just here to check in on how you're doing. You know, how's your sleep? How's your mood? Have you heard of our service? Do you know that you can reach out?" So the outreach function, I think, is key. And for that reason, we didn't see those usual discrepancies. We also thought very hard about recruitment. We've recruited people that speak additional languages. We've recruited people from within the community. That's perhaps an area I didn't talk about. I always feel like I miss so many areas when I'm talking about Grenfell. One of the reasons people don't access mental health services is because they think that people don't understand them. And they think people don't understand them because they're removed from their culture or they're removed from their socioeconomic status. They feel judged and stigmatized. So we've put a lot of effort into our recruitment strategy to make sure that people don't need to fill out a referral form, for example. So we've also thought about access. People can go to their mosque and say, talk to their imam, and their imam can ring us and say, "Do you want to come and do a drop-in session? Because I've had a number of people coming to talk to me about X." So between outreach and recruitment and points of access, I think the front end development of those parts of the service are really key to making sure that we can reach out to everybody that needs to be reached, not wait for them to walk through the clinic door.
Okay. That's great. I have got, it's not a question, but it's a comments. Yeah, presentation has been informative and quite encouraging. Is it possible to get some reading materials, references through our emails from the presenter? So what I would suggest is if you send your email directly to ISSUP UK chapter, and we will try and get these references, whatever relevant references we have, which Jay has, and we'll send it to you.
Absolutely, more than happy to do that. I've just put it up on the screen, but it's probably too small for people to read. I'm more than happy to share that, absolutely.
Okay. Again, I cannot have any other questions in here. Just to say, thank you very much, Jay. I mean, this has been a fantastic presentation. There are a lot of similarities, a lot of parallels working in the field of substance use. And you have touched a lot on the design of services and how we need to rethink out of the box to attract people, to get people to to come to us. And how do we reach them? We need to go and find them. And a lot of the traumatic experience which you encountered, they are not dissimilar to, not as tragic perhaps, but not dissimilar, especially in those countries who are working in conflict zones. We have it's a global audience, and I just hope that people will be able to refer to this presentation and see what are some of the materials that presented and how transferable they are for their own services, and to look at issues around stress management in the workforce, because we work in a very difficult field, and we need to be able to take care of our staff. Great. Thank you so much, Jay. And if there's no
Thanks
other
for having
question,
me.
I say thank you to all the participants, and it's great to have you on board, and see you next time again, all of you. Thank you so much. Bye to all.